Hey, we are in our next to the last week, looking in the unit entitled Distinct, Living Above the Norm. This week, we are looking in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 42, and looking at the topic of being distinct in my reactions. And the point of this lesson is to practice grace and integrity when others make demands of you. This week we're going to be looking at what's at the very core of a person's character. And as we look in verses 33 through 37, we look at what Jesus has to say about taking oaths. And if we look in James chapter 5, verse 12, James reflects a very similar sentiment. James says, "Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned." So we have here in the book of James, as well as in Matthew chapter 5, some words against taking oaths. And so what does that mean? Does that mean we're not supposed to take wedding vows? What if we're called into court? Are we not supposed to raise our right hand and make that vow? I really think here Jesus was condemning that external righteousness. Remember, that's what he's talking about mainly in these in this chapter, is how our outward appearance and our inward motivation, our heart, how they can differ so much. And so I think he is condemning that external righteousness, those behaviors that conceal that internal, that sinful heart, that sinful attitude. I believe he was speaking against people who were more interested in being believed than in being truthful, that they were more interested in being believed than being godly. You know, the Old Testament is full of places that talks about taking oaths, and every place you did that, you swore by God. And so you were to do that by God and by God alone. So when Jesus addresses the Pharisees over in Matthew 23, he condemns them for using some objects to make their promise seem believable by swearing by heaven or by earth or by the altar or by gold or whatever. And Jesus says here in Matthew 5 to don't do that. Don't even swear by the hair on your head. So what people were doing, they were concocting a way to make a promise seem binding. But they didn't swear by God. They had a little escape clause, a little loophole. Similar to a child when he's telling a lie or maybe even a half-truth and he's sitting there with his fingers crossed behind his back, looking for that loophole. And I think that's what Jesus is addressing here. See, Jesus wants his followers to be known by their character. And a simple yes and a simple no will suffice. Because oaths are made because lying exists. If everybody told the truth, you wouldn't have to say, "I promise," or "I swear," or "I swear on my mother's grave," or whatever. In fact, you may know some people, every time they try to tell you something, they say something to the effect of, "Well, you can just ask so-and-so. You can just ask your mother. You can just ask your dad. You can just ask your brother. He'll tell you the truth, that I'm telling the truth." Other statements like "Scout's honor," or "Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye," those kind of sayings. You don't need to say that. A person's character should be such that when he says yes or she says no, that no further promises are needed. We get down to verses 38 and 39, and this has to do with retaliation and revenge. And again, Jesus uses the "you've heard it said, but I say unto you." So you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That Old Testament allowance for an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was not given so the injured party could bring about justice. It was given to show mercy to the one who made the error, who did the crime, who erred against somebody. It was instigated so the punishment would fit the crime, so it wouldn't be too strict, but there again, it wouldn't be too lenient either. It was given for society to administer, not for a personal vendetta. It was to protect someone from wanting to get paid back and then some. You see, because revenge escalates, it doesn't settle offenses. We can see that with war or with gang activity, that when one person is killed on one side, then that side wants to get revenge, so they're going to take out 5 or 10 or more of the other side just to show them who's the boss. And this goes back and forth. So with these verses, as well as verses 40 to 42, the point here is you don't meet hatred with hatred. You meet it with a radical response of love. Because the characteristic of a Christ follower should include these traits: generosity, putting others' needs above yourself, going that extra mile, which is literal here as we read about going the extra mile with a soldier. And another characteristic of Christ followers should be one of love. I'll give you a great example of this. Several years ago, there was a church in the Nashville area. Its name was Two Rivers Church. And there was another church who was coming to visit it, and it was the Westboro Baptist Church from Topeka. And of course, we know what they do. They like to picket funerals and picket churches that seem to disagree with their line of thinking. And as Westboro does, they put out a press release about 6 weeks ahead of time telling where they were going to be. And so the church had a heads up. It wasn't like they showed up on a Sunday and there were picketers out there that they didn't know about. No, they had advance warning. They knew that they were going to show up. And so they knew not only were the picketers going to show up, but there were going to be the counter-protesters. You know, that's the people who stand there and shout at the protesters about how wrong they are. And then on top of that, the media was going to be there and record it all. So what Two Rivers Church decided to do is they decided not to ignore the problem. And they decided not to be involved in the counter-protest, because that really gets pretty ugly when people are shouting, and it boils down to a shouting match. And that's just not productive at all. So they decided not to do either one of those things. And what they did is they set up a table that was close to the protesters, the counter-protesters, and the media, and they served coffee and donuts. Now, I don't know if their goal here was to heap burning coals on the heads of their enemies or what, but they met opposition with love. And so that is the characteristics that I believe Christ is looking for in his followers. Now, how does that contrast with the attitude of so many Christians today? They are often on the side of either the protesters or the counter-protesters, depending on the issue, shouting and screaming ugly things. That's not very Christ-like. They can also be pretty nice folks until you disagree with their political party, depending on what side you're on. That can go either way. Also, some people, well-meaning, loving Christians, seem to revel in the fact that a convicted murderer is going to the electric chair, standing outside the prison holding signs that say, "Burn, baby, burn," and those kind of statements. But you see, Jesus calls his followers to live above the norm, to be distinct. It's not natural. If it were natural, it would be the norm. He calls us to live above the norm, to be distinct. And it's a difficult thing to do, and we can't do that on our own. That's why we've got to have Christ in our life to help us with that. That's also why we need each other, to hold each other accountable and to encourage each other. So this leads us into next week's lesson. It'll be the final lesson in this series, and it's called Distinct in My Love, and we'll be looking at loving our enemies. So, hope you have a great Sunday school lesson, and I hope to see you Sunday.